All right, moving on to the features of the skull. We've already talked about a few of these. Now, obviously, we have things like the orbits, the teeth, some of those things that are not actually listed on your sheet. But we're going to focus on a few of the other features that are very important for you to learn. All right, so first, we're actually going to start on the inferior view, looking from the bottom of the skull. And you remember this is the occipital bone on either side of the foramen magnum. And we have this big bump. You can see it best from this angle. But you can also see it here, this big bump that sticks out on the back of the skull. We call that the external occipital protuberance. So it protrudes, it's a protuberance. External occipital protuberance. And then on either side of the foramen magnum, we have this occipital condyle. There's one here and one here, the occipital condyles, these big ridges that are raised up areas on either side of the foramen magnum. And as we've already mentioned, we have these important processes that give us the name stylomastoid foramen. We have the mastoid process right here and right here. Those big bumps that stick up. Right here, the mastoid process. And then the styloid process. And as you can see from this angle on either side, they look almost like pencils or little styli sticking up, just like a stylus you would use for like a computer or a tablet or something like that. So mastoid process, styloid process. And we'll talk about an additional styloid process when we get into the bones of the arms. Then we have several features that are on the front of the skull. So first, the zygomatic process. So remember, this is the zygomatic bone right here where the cheekbone is. So the zygomatic process is this big projection of the temporal bone towards the zygomatic bone, the zygomatic process. And then as we look at the jaw, the mandible, we have several important features. We have the body, which is this main portion in the front. And we describe the body all the way up till the angle. So the angle is this place where the direction of the bone changes, the mandibular angle. And then this part that projects upward is called the ramus. So the body, the angle, and the ramus. All right, plural rami. And so as you notice on the top is the rami come directionally inward and upward towards the skull. We have this kind of a U shape. And this actually allows the jaw to attach in at the temporomandibular joint. So we have two features here. This is called the coronoid process, number 49 on your sheet. And this is called the mandibular condyle. Your book calls this the condylar process. I would accept either term. So the coronoid process and the mandibular condyle are the condylar process of the mandible. Either one is correct. And what happens here is this would directly fit in with the skull. So if we were to flip the skull upside down, we can actually see the surface right here that the mandible sits in, or the jaw sits in. So that's called the mandibular fossa. So a fossa is like a face or a side. So that little indentation right there is the mandibular fossa. All right, next we have the lacrimal fossa. So back on the front of the face, the lacrimal fossa is basically where that little foramen is, right? Where your tear duct sits in your eyes on either side, your lacrimal fossa. So obviously on your lacrimal bone. We have the palatine process. So this is a part of the maxilla or the maxillary bone. So remember, this is the palatine bone right here where my finger is. And then more anterior to that, we have the maxilla. So this roof of the mouth portion of the maxilla is referred to as the palatine process. So the palatine bone right here and the palatine process of the maxilla or the maxillary bone. All right, the next few features are going to be deep inside of the skull. So we're going to roll it over and pop open the top. All right, remember this is the frontal bone and then the ethmoid bone. So there's several important features of the ethmoid bone. We already talked about those little foramina that sit up there. But we haven't talked about the other portion. So this tall point, almost like a ridge right at the top of the ethmoid bone, we call that the crista galli. Okay, crista galli, that ridge. And on either side, we have a cribiform plate. So that's a cribiform plate, that's a cribiform plate. Now on the test, I would have to have it broken into sections to ask you, am I asking about the little foramina, or am I talking about the actual features? So here I would label this like as a ridge with an arrow, the Cristogalla, or Cristogalli rather, and on either side here, the cribiform plate. Now, the next thing is actually the perpendicular plate. That's part of the ethmoid bone, but to see that, we actually have to look at the nose. Okay? So the same bone, if you see where my finger is, it's touching the Cristogalli. And if we look, this same bone connects in right into the nose, and we see the nasal septum. So that's the division between the two sections of the nose. And that bone right in the middle that forms the middle wall, the medial wall of the nose, that is the perpendicular plate. Okay, and as you can see, it goes down perpendicularly through the nostril. So that's the perpendicular plate right there, right by my thumb. Okay, and these are the cribiform plates on either side. Working our way posteriorly, we have the sella turcica. All right, so there's the lesser wings on either side, the greater wings down here. So just below the lesser wings, we have this kind of surface area. There's a part that sticks up. It's a little hard to see, but I can almost put my pen right through this little indention. And this little smooth area is called the sella turcica. All right, and then finally we have the inferior and middle nasal conchae. Okay, concha is singular, conchae is plural. So the inferior can be these lower two ridges on either side, and the middle is going to be this upper one we can see. We can't actually see the superior. So middle and inferior nasal conchae.